Daly named it after him. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming today, and welcome to Butte Archives if you've never been here before. Thanks for coming back if you're returning. Today we have Brenda Wahler with us, and she will be presenting on James Ben Ali Haggin and the checkbook behind Marcus Daly and the Anaconda Company. James Ben Ali Haggin allegedly handed Marcus Daly his checkbook with every blank check signed and said, "Draw and keep drawing." Haggin's fortune, built over 30 years of struggle, gave him compassion for a young and struggling Daly. His checkbook funded the Anaconda smelter and kept the company afloat through price wars, attempts to corner the copper market, fires, sabotage, and mine disasters. Haggin and Daly were also bonded closely through their love of racehorses, and between them created a turf empire that still influences modern horse racing. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you.
Present and go ahead.
All right. Well, first off, thank you everybody for coming, and I also want to thank the Butte-Silver Public Archives for bringing me back again. So I like it when I get repeat calls, so I guess I have to do my best to not be, try my best not to bore you. So with that, first thing a lot of people have been asking me is when my next Marcus Daly book is coming out. We have a release date, March 3rd, 2026, so I said it was going to be a year, it turned out to be 3 years, but it is coming, so I'm delighted to let you know about that. And it's even available for pre-order. I think you should talk to the folks here at the Butte-Silver Archives so you can purchase through them, but if you're really impatient, you can also pre-order on that, that website out there, that book place we don't talk about out loud.
Do you mind if I'm sorry, I forgot to let them know that they could purchase your books.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Sorry, for books, Marcus Daly's Road to Montana we have, and Montana Horse Racing out front. Daly's Road to Montana is $23.99 and horse racing is $22. And if we run out of copies, Brenda also has a few here herself. Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay, understood. Appreciate the pitch. So, when we're talking about who is James Ben Ali Haggin, the first thing we need to know about is, anybody recognize that ridgeline?
Okay.
And a lot of people wonder, who is this guy? Why did he get a mountain named after him? And he got a mountain named after him for very good reasons, and you had some spoilers in the intro, and that was really only the beginning of what he did to make it possible for the Anaconda Company to be the behemoth that it became. The first thing we do is we step back. I'm going to give you kind of why he got the mountain named, and then I'm going to go back and we're going to talk about his history, his background, and you'll see how that all works. In the 1850s in California, George Hearst, James Ben Ali Haggin, and Lloyd Tevis formed any number of business partnerships that collectively became known as Hearst, Haggin, Tevis and Company. And they were kind of the dream team. Hearst was a miner, and he had that ability to locate promising mining claims, gold, silver, and so on. Kind of the senior member of the bunch. And I love this picture of Hearst. It's one of my favorites. I think that if you want to know George Hearst, this one captures him. And then Tevis and Haggin were both from Kentucky originally and came out to California in the 1849-1850 period. I think each of them kind of thought maybe they'd prospect for gold, but then they realized they better keep their day job, and that turned out to be far more lucrative. Tevis drifts into banking. Haggin trained as a lawyer. And then the two of them got together and created a land and law and land office business. So how did they connect to Marcus Daly? What they did was we don't know for sure when Daly met George Hearst, but he probably met Hearst before the others. There's a mythic tale of how he met him as early as 1864 that is about 5 different stories cobbled together, and the tall tale is nonsense, but I talk about that in Road to Montana, so if you haven't read the book, we tell you that story there. But the big thing is that in 1872, Daly was working in Utah for the Walker brothers that later sent him to Montana, and they were not interested in a particular little mining claim called the Ontario. There was a silver claim. And Daly told Hearst he should check it out. Hearst did. Hearst bought. The Ontario became the largest single silver mine in the United States. So Hearst, he looked upon Daly as a smart young guy. He didn't necessarily see him as any kind of an equal partner, but he knew a bright young man when he saw one. Then what we have, that same year, Haggin and Daly take over Wells Fargo. And through a lot of their other manipulations, Lloyd Tevis becomes the president of Wells Fargo, Haggin's the vice president, and that's often how they operated. Tevis was very talkative, very outgoing. If you didn't know what Lloyd Tevis was thinking, he would tell you he could think 5 times as fast as any man in San Francisco, and he never shut up. Haggin was very cool. He always was keeping his powder dry, and he was the gambler. He was the one that would make the bold, risky moves, but he'd keep all those cards very close to his chest, and you never knew what he was thinking until he did it. And in that way, he was a little bit, Marcus Daly became very close to Haggin. I think there was almost a father transference going on there. And while Daly was very outgoing and very gregarious, he also played his cards close to his chest. He hid in plain sight. So between the two of them, they were able to cook up any number of things that nobody knew what was going to go down until it went down. So they were very compatible personalities. Now, the Daly side of this is when Daly and Charles Larrabee bought into the St. Lawrence in 1878. There was also some correspondence and some news articles that Daly was scouting gold mines over by Helena. And that came to the attention of Samuel Hauser, who wrote to A.J. Davis, because remember they were partners here in Butte, that Daly represents Haggin in all manners. And so what was Daly doing in 1878 for Haggin? We don't know, other than scouting some mines over by Helena. There's a historian, K. Ross Toole. He speculated that Daly may have been prospecting the Anaconda itself for Haggin. We don't have any proof, but that was his theory. And given that the Anaconda was originally purchased as a silver property, it's kind of tricky to know what they were doing, because they record ownership. If you go over to the courthouse, the recorded ownership transfer of the Anaconda from Michael Hickey to a partnership of Hickey, Larrabee, and Daly occurred in July of 1880. But Daly gives an interview in 1895 where he talks about how he got an option on the Anaconda, and then he, expanded it from a 35-foot hole in the ground to something bigger and deeper. I love this picture of these guys with the windlass, because that is how the Anaconda started. It was with a couple of guys doing that. So it's possible that Daly had an option on the Anaconda same year he had purchased the St. Lawrence claim. So who knows, but it's fascinating. At any rate, as soon as he records ownership of the Anaconda, this is also when he quits the Alice, and I don't think Margaret took in laundry. I think this was all a plan. He either didn't tell Margaret and she threatened to take in laundry, or else the two of them were colluding. And she was making a lot of noise, and everybody thinks he's crazy and he's going to go broke, and she was part of the misdirection, who knows. But he makes 3 trips to California in 1880, 1881. And at the end of the multiple road trips, all of a sudden, Hearst, Haggin, and Tevis purchased the Anaconda, giving Daly about a 25% share, and that ownership transfer occurs in June of 1881. So, the Anaconda Gold and Silver Mining Company goes for about a year until early 1882. Daly's got the St. Lawrence, Daly's got the Anaconda. All of these mines are part of this Anaconda Gold and Silver Company. And then they hit copper. And there's again a number of mythic tales of the first time they hit copper. And I'm beginning to suspect they actually hit copper in the St. Lawrence before they hit it in the Anaconda, but again, we can only speculate, we don't know. But Butte is becoming a copper camp. And I want to do a shout out to Larry, who's part of my brain trust here, has helped me understand that the technology of Butte could not process all the ore that was coming out of the mines. There was too much of it. Only the very highest grade was worth putting onto narrow gauge rail, Utah Northern, and trying to ship it down to the Transcontinental Rail line to the East Coast to put it on a ship, send it to Swansea, Wales, and eventually come back. So there's all this ore that could be profitable if it could be reduced, if you could concentrate it, but it's not profitable yet. So Daly envisions building a great smelter in Montana that can handle the output and get rid of all of the impurities. And you folks here know way more about the ores of Butte and the problems with those ores than I do. But it's a very complex, very refractory ore. And so Daly goes hat in hand off to California to convince his partners that he needs to build a smelter and they need to bankroll it. And they're rich people. George Hearst, he owns a newspaper, he owns the Ontario, he's bought the Home State Gold Mine in South Dakota, he's got the Anaconda, he's got mines in Arizona. But when Daly gets there in June of 1882, he's also busy trying to get himself elected governor of California. And it's a losing race. He's trying to convince the convention to pick him as the primary candidate. He's spending money like water on delegates and alcohol and free food and all those kind of things. And Daly shows up just about the time that the convention, on like their 14th ballot, says, no, George, we're picking somebody else. So Hearst is bleeding money and he's in a terrible mood. Tevis, he thinks the whole thing's nuts. He's not a miner, he's a banker, he's tight-fisted, he's very controlling, he's a little impulsive, and he tells Daly basically, hey, you put your money in, maybe we'll help you bankroll it, and Daly's going, well, guys, that hole in the ground and the guys with the windlass, I've been putting every dime I have already in the ground, I'm broke. And so Tevis, who is the villain of our story, says, well, I guess you can just sell out your shares then. And Daly's going, heart in his throat, may have started getting his first gray hairs if he didn't already have some. And that's when we have the story of Haggin's checkbook. And so, what actually happened has been I'm sorry, my words aren't working today, has been part of myth for a long time. And the mythology of it is that Haggin literally handed Daly his checkbook full of blank checks and signed every one of them and said, I'll see Daly through on this deal, and may have said at the same time, or he may have said it a year or so later, when you need money, draw and just keep drawing. So Haggin basically bankrolls the Anaconda smelter. Now, why did he do that? Interesting character. The first thing to know about Haggin is that he's not a young man, even by 1882. And he's wealthy really beyond anybody's imagination. These guys, their fortunes on paper are huge, and probably their fortunes that were not on paper were even larger. He grew up in Kentucky. He was a child of the bluegrass. He was also extremely private. He never discussed his childhood. And so there's a lot of myths about who he was, where he came from, how he got rich. You can't make this stuff up. And yet, a lot of stuff about Haggin got made up. So the first thing was his dad, a man named Temple Haggin, upper middle class. He was himself a lawyer. He was a landowner. He was what they would call a planter, which meant he owned a small number of slaves and they worked the land for him. He had about 200 acres. So he wasn't like the Kentucky elite, but he was the Kentucky respected upper middle class kind of a person. So he had some status in colonial Kentucky and early in the 1800s. The interesting person is Haggin's mom. And Ben Ali Haggin was the daughter of Ibrahim Ben Ali, who was born in Turkey, and you know, whether he was born in, was it Istanbul or Constantinople, I'm going to put that song in your head, and now you guys are all going to thank me for an earworm. But Ibrahim Ben Ali was a soldier. We don't know, again, the myths are, was he an officer, was he an elite soldier, what was he, we don't know, but he was in the Ottoman military, and they were sent to go fight the Russians. Probably the Russo-Turkish War started in 1787. He somehow winds up in Europe, gets captured, he's a prisoner of war, and through various trials and tribulations, and again, mostly mythic, the tales of Ibrahim Ben Ali are hard to know what's true and what's not, but what we know is somehow he got to England, where he was mentored by kind of an Episcopal religious figure, converted to Christianity somewhere along the way, or may have been Christian from the get-go, we don't know, but he studied medicine at Dublin College and then came to America. When he got to America, he married a woman named Susan Colvin, and she was, again, another upper middle class, very respectable family kind of person, and of course he's a brilliant young doctor and everything's wonderful. But unfortunately, while she is pregnant, they moved to Baltimore just in time for a yellow fever epidemic. Ben Ali is a physician. He starts treating patients, and 3 weeks after their daughter is born, he dies. So Ben Ali Haggin is a child, an infant, with a mother who is widowed. She remarries. She marries a fairly decent guy, has a couple more kids. They send Adeline off to boarding school, and she gets a very good education, but she's got to make her way in the world. So she shows up in Harrisburg, Kentucky, and when she's about 18 years old. And in those days, that part of Kentucky was pretty rural. It was still kind of the frontier, you're just a few years past Daniel Boone, you're still talking about whether, statehood is going to be granted. And she arrives, and remember, there's no trains, there's no canals, everything has to be packed in wagons. She shows up with a piano. Imagine you're taking a piano from New York over the Appalachians into Kentucky, and you arrive in Harrisburg, Kentucky with a piano. And she's beautiful. This is the only picture that's known to exist of her, but apparently, she's kind of exotic and cool, and, the young men would gather around listening to her play music every, Sunday or Saturday or whatever. And she winds up marrying Temple Haggin. And so They have many children, pretty long life, pretty good marriage as far as we know. But James Ben Ali Haggin, he's her second child. She gives him her grandfather's last name, becomes his middle name. But take a look at this. There's her, there's him. He got the ethnic looks. He got the Turkish looks. He got the dark skin. He got the dark hair. And all of his life, he is called the Turk. He is called, they called him, Kentucky's Kubla Khan, the Croesus of California. If you're going to understand Haggin, you need to understand his life through the fact that he is a dark-skinned man in Kentucky when he grows up. And that could not have been easy. But at the same time, as we're going to see in a moment, he also owns it. He just like, you can't beat him, then he puts it in your face. Now, did he have to put up with racial slurs? Yes. And one of the many theories for the Clark-Daly feud was that at one point in time, I think the feud had already started. And in my next book, I'm going to tell you all about why I think the feud started in probably the day that Daly reached Butte in 1876, but it exploded into the open with the election of 1888, as we all know. But probably in 1889, Clark got impatient with Haggin and said that he was not going to wait around for Haggin to show up at a meeting, and he wasn't going to wait around, allegedly, he said, for a member of the Ethiopian race. Except if we think about this, they think the word he used was not Ethiopian. It was probably a little harsher word that we don't say out loud these days. And Haggin found out about it and did not take it well. And it continued to get worse. When we look at the capital fight of 1894, when Haggin and Daly are meeting together out here in Montana in September, the Clark-controlled newspapers, they call him simultaneously the Turk and a Shylock. And I'm like, okay, so we've got Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. This guy could not win, especially because he was Christian and he was only a quarter Turkish. So, that was the 19th century. On the other hand, the people who liked him also were not comfortable with his ethnic background. And there's letters from William Scallon, who was Daly's lawyer and succeeded Daly initially as head of the Anaconda company after he died, where he's writing letters to people saying, we're trying to figure out, Mr. Haggin and this and that and the other thing. And he had stuff like, oh, I've heard his grandfather was Turkish. I don't want to slander him. That sounds like a slur. And then he writes another letter going, oh, I guess he does have Turkish ancestry, but his mother, remember Adelaide Ben Ali? She was a Circassian princess, and she was rescued by a sea captain. And just the stories. And she loses her name. Somebody thought her name was Charlotte. It's just all of these myths grow up around Haggin, and nobody understands who he really is. So he decides that one of the things he's going to do is say, I am who I am, and if you don't like it, I'm richer than you, I'm more powerful than you, and I can do anything bigger and better than you can. He names one of his racehorses is Ben Ali. 2 of his 5 children, their middle name is Ben Ali. And he also begins to get quite a collection of, it was an Oriental period in the late 19th century where Oriental meaning Eastern Hemisphere, which included the Middle East, a lot of romanticism of Egypt and Syria and Arabia. And he starts to collect all of this art. He also travels extensively in Europe in the 1870s. But his decision is just, here I am who I am. I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm not going to explain anything. I'm just going to show you that I am the biggest dog on the block. So, as a young adult, he studies law. Then he tries to open a law practice in Shelbyville, Kentucky. It doesn't go real well. He tries to run for a minor political office, which is what you did if you wanted to join the Kentucky elite. He is defeated soundly and very disappointed. So he packs up his bags, leaves Kentucky, knocks the dust from his sandals, and settles in Natchez, Mississippi. This is an ethnically diverse community where being dark-skinned and ethnic-looking, nobody cares. This is same thing like New Orleans. It's an ethnically diverse community. But there he meets a pretty girl who moved from Kentucky with her father and the rest of her family, Eliza Saunders. Marries her. They go on to have 5 kids. Her dad is also a lawyer, so he and Haggin go into practice. Then they expand their office from Natchez to New Orleans. But Haggin wants to make more money. He wants to make his fortune. And so he heads to California. And remember, we're talking about 1849 around, thereabouts, 1850. This is a map of Panama. And in these days, the canal wasn't built yet. So if you're going to go to California, and you don't want to go clear around South America and down around the Cape, you are going to take a boat, or ship, sorry, I'm from Montana, from the eastern United States. In his case, he probably set himself in New Orleans. And you see the top of that map is the Atlantic Ocean because Panama kind of goes like this. And so you take a ship to the eastern side or northern side of the Isthmus of Panama. Then you get off the ship and you got in a rowboat and you went up this river. I'll use my pointer. So your ship comes in, you get in a rowboat, native people row you up the river to the summit of the isthmus. And then you run out of water and you put all your stuff on pack mules and you take pack mules down to the western port. Then you sit around and wait till the ship shows up. And in Haggin's case, it took a month. He got yellow fever. He had to survive. There were riots between indigenous people and people heading for the California gold fields and the local colonial powers. So it was a very dangerous, very difficult place. And he was extraordinarily glad to get to California. Once there, he meets up with Lloyd Tevis. And we don't know if they already knew each other in Kentucky. They were from the same general area, same social class. They probably at least knew of each other's families if they didn't know each other personally. But they became pretty good buddies. They opened this land and law business. And Tevis, he was working in the courthouse, the county handling land deeds. He knew who was buying, who was selling, what mining claims were being filed. He knew where the action was. So he had this inside scoop. And then Haggin had an expertise in property law. And so between the two of them, they are buying, sometimes cheating probably, we don't know, but probably not entirely always honest. But they get huge, huge, huge amounts of land. So they start in San Francisco, start in Sacramento, move to San Francisco. Along the way, Haggin makes his fortune enough that he can afford to have his wife and children come from New Orleans to California. And given that, you've got the wife and 5 kids, you want to kind of have them travel in style, so you have to have some money to bring them with more safety and more comfort than he had. So she also comes, Eliza arrives with her sister and her father. I mean, the whole family packs up and comes to California. Tevis marries Eliza Haggin's sister. And so now, Haggin and Tevis are brothers-in-law as well as business partners. And they get along pretty well. This picture shows you in the background, this was the mansion Haggin built in San Francisco. This was on Nob Hill, they called it. And when you wonder about Haggin and he had to be the biggest and the best of everything, That was probably the biggest mansion on Nob Hill. It does not exist today. I believe it collapsed in the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, but that was the headquarters of James Ben Ali Haggin. Now, not only did, of course, they have mining properties because they had teamed up with George Hearst, and not only did they have banks, and not only did Tevis invest in express mail and railroads and telegraphs and all kinds of other things, but their land purchases were extensive. This photograph is from the Central Valley, one of the many ranches they had. Haggin's favorite property, probably, was the Rancho del Paso. And I'm going to show you a map in a moment, but that was roughly where northern Sacramento is today. That was 44,000 acres. The land deal where he and Tevis purchased it winds up going, I think, clear up to the United States Supreme Court. Some other cases did. A fight over water rights did. Lux v. Haggin, that was another one. But Rancho del Paso is where he builds his thoroughbred horse breeding operation. He and Tevis also create the Kern County Land Company in 1874, which comes to control over 400,000 acres in Central California, which, if you're wondering, why we eat broccoli and almonds and all those other things that come out of the San Joaquin Valley, largely this was land that was consolidated by Haggin and Tevis. Some of the irrigation projects had already started, but they were the ones who funded some of the biggest irrigation projects down there. In a lot of ways, they created California's agricultural heartland. Again, Haggin never did anything on a small scale. It was always a very biggest and best everything. Ultimately, between Hearst, Haggin, and Tevis, they probably controlled over 1.3 million acres across the West. And if you can't visualize 1 million acres, Glacier National Park is 1 million acres. So imagine that kind of land ownership. And I mean, that includes their Anaconda properties, it includes Arizona, South Dakota, Montana, and everywhere else. For those of you not familiar with California geography, here's Sacramento, and the purple Rancho del Paso is about here, but there's also their land holdings extended clear down. There's a Haggin Museum in Stockton, California, and a lot of influence there. You keep going down the San Joaquin Valley to Bakersfield. This was the center, this is Kern County down here. So they owned, 400,000 acres in this vicinity and, several 100,000 more up here, plus their holdings in other states. This is what I did. This gives you a sense of scale. This was a map of Rancho del Paso. It's a 1910 map. Haggin pretty much sold Rancho del Paso by 1906. And so this was buy land in Rancho del Paso, let's subdivide it. Showing you original Sacramento. And I'm not sure if just the colored chunks were Rancho del Paso or if it was this whole white map. I kind of look at where that is, and I think you're looking at most of it. But the fascinating thing here, I'm going to show you a little bit of, I had some fun with PowerPoint. If you look at this, and I want you to pay close attention, focus your attention on the Sacramento, this little Y-shaped curve. You've got the American River, kind of loops down here. American River flows in the Sacramento River, this little Y. And remember, this was just San Francisco in 1910. Watch what happens. Overlay, exact same area. What do we have? Del Paso Heights, Hagenwood. There's a Del Paso Boulevard in here. This is all part of modern day Sacramento. Now, where does Haggin's checkbook come into the Anaconda Company? His diversified holdings. And this is just the This is just the Cliff's Notes version of what he had. But vertical integration on a mass scale, this is how we get to the kind of resources where Haggin is willing to bet huge amounts of money on Marcus Daly. Just like he'll go to the horse races and he'll bet tens of thousands of dollars on his race horses. He wins a few, he loses a few, but he only has to win a few big ones to come out ahead in the long run. He's a plunger. And we don't see that any more clearly than at the track. What I'm going to be doing with my next book that'll be coming out in March is I talk about how Marcus Daly was revealed at the racetrack. So is Haggin. This is where these guys are dropping their guard. This is where you see how their brains work. Because you watch, what did they do with horses? And the sports press was as gossipy then as they are now. I mean, football season, anybody? You follow all the celebrities, you follow all the stars. Horses were celebrities in the 19th century. And the reporters would track, I mean, they would just stalk their owners, their trainers, their jockeys. These guys were a National Enquirer equivalent. You know, if you start searching on Haggin in 1890, you're going to come up with 3,765,292 estimated hits. Most of them are his racehorses. So you can figure out, was he at the track that day? Well, he was, so was he in New York? Ooh, business deal was going down in New York City, wasn't it? Because he wouldn't have been following his horses around the circuit. He was only there if he happened to be in town anyway. And the same is true of Marcus Daly. The thing you're going to see too is this risk tolerance. He is really good at playing chicken. You can't call his bluff. He calls your bluff. And you don't know what he's thinking. Ultimately, his racehorse operation was the largest, definitely the largest in the United States. At Rancho del Paso, he stood over 30 stallions. Most places have 1, 2. I think Daly wound up with 6 or 7. The estimate of how many horses total he owned varies, but it was in the thousands. And these horses, he shipped them, thanks to railroads, he shipped them all over the country. He imported from Australia. This horse up here was an Australian import. He ships them to the East Coast. He ships horses in from England. He's bringing in horses from all over the world. He's selling horses all over the world. And this is where his heart is at. He truly does love horses. It's, as they say down in Kentucky, it's bred in the bone. I will not bore you too much with racehorse trivia because I could talk about it forever, and we've only got a short time today. But his first breakout on the East Coast was a horse named Tyrant, who won a couple of very big races in 1885. The one we know about today was the Belmont Stakes, which is one of the Triple Crown races that still happens every year. These were the biggest wins for California horses in history up to that time. And there's a real East Coast, West Coast tension in horse racing, which still exists today, by the way. And the Californians were very driven to say, we are as good as you East Coast people. They are, even though our horses had to get on a train and travel thousands of miles on a rail car for days on end, and then get off the train and then get back into racing condition. I mean, imagine, if you're doing a transatlantic flight on an airplane, when you sit in an airplane for 18 hours, you don't feel so good. Can you imagine being a horse in a tie stall about yay wide, and you're on a train going like this for a week? That's when a California horse could win races that big. They either came out to the East Coast very early in the year and had several months of a layover, or they were tough as nails, or both. Daly's little namesake horse, Ben Ali, was named for his son, James Ben Ali Haggin Jr., who oversaw the horse racing operation. And Ben Ali won the Kentucky Derby in 1886. This was one of the most fun stories about Haggin because he wanted to bet about, the numbers vary and they grow the farther you get from 1886 and you read news accounts, but the best estimate is he wanted to bet about $50,000 in 1886 money on Ben Ali. But the guy that ran Churchill Downs was named for Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr. Yes, grandson of Lewis and Clark, the William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition, not the William Clark of Butte. And the colonel, he married a Churchill, that was his wife, and this was his racetrack. And he was trying to do some stuff where he was going to make the bookies pay a licensing fee, and there's all sorts of drama. And the bookies got mad at the colonel and boycotted the track. Haggin, in one of the few times that he tips his hand, and like I say, he normally keeps his powder very dry, he doesn't lose his cool, but he's in Kentucky, and remember, Kentucky didn't treat him well. He left in disgust. He's back at the Kentucky Derby. He's a big deal now. He's rich, he's important, and he comes up to Colonel Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr. and says, "You will reinstitute the bookmaking system so that I can place my bets." Colonel Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr. tells Haggin that he can take his horses and go to hell, literally. And so the race is run, Ben Ali wins, but Haggin gets so ticked off that he just removes every horse from Churchill Downs and he ships most of them off to another track in Kentucky and then on to the East Coast. And he throws Churchill Downs into a slump for years because he tells everybody else, don't go there, they're a bunch of, no good people. He goes on, he has a number of other champion racehorses, mostly on the East Coast, and his gold and blue racing silks. I love these cigarette cards because they put these pretty girls on them, except girls couldn't be jockeys, so, they're girly pictures. But probably his greatest horse was this horse named Sabotage, who won a major match race in 1890. And so I just love these old Currier and Ives pictures, especially the way they rode without short stirrups. That's the way they did it. They actually had not just whips, but spurs back then, and it just makes me cringe. But anyway, I do love these old paintings. So you're wondering, okay, Brenda, quit talking about horses. What's going on in Anaconda in 1890? Well, starting about 1883, when the upper works comes online, the copper mining interests around Lake Superior in Michigan on the Keweenaw Peninsula, they think they're mad about Anaconda starting to dump copper on the world market, and it's depressing the price a little bit. So they think they can drive Anaconda out of business if they keep cutting the price of copper, because they'd had a monopoly, and they could set their own price, and so they're dropping the price, trying to bankrupt Anaconda. Haggin pretty much tells Daly, well, we'll meet that price by increasing the capacity of the smelter. So Daly is constantly upgrading technology, upgrading capacity. He ultimately winds up building the lower works through 1883 to 1886. Finally, Michigan rolls over and cries uncle because Haggin can undercut the Michigan copper interests. So then, right about the time that's settling down, the world market notices that there's a glut of copper as well, and we start seeing a group of people, a group of French and British bankers. Several different banks are involved. It's extremely complex. But one of the heads is a fellow by the name of Hyacinthe Secretan, which, anyway, he comes up with this idea of forming a company and attempts to corner the copper market. And ultimately it fails. He almost crashes the banks of Europe. Some of this because Haggin is playing chicken with Secretan, saying, hey, we had copper at 15 cents a pound, but it bottomed out at about 9 or 10 cents a pound with Michigan. We still made a profit. Why, you want to cut it to 5 cents a pound? Guess what? We'll cut it to 3. We'll still make a profit. All Haggin had to do was just tell Daly to keep putting out copper and not to worry too much about the price. And so as this banking syndicate collapses, Haggin is able to secure long-term contracts at a reasonable price that allows Anaconda to finally make a profit. And in the process of doing all this, he starts getting to know any number of European bankers, and these guys are going to play a major role in a few years with the restructuring of the Anaconda Company. So he celebrates his win. In 1890, he's at the top of the world. Haggin, Salvatore won his great match race. This is a wonderful picture I love to show people. This is called the Salvatore Clam Bake. And this was a huge party that they threw after Salvatore had won some major races. All of these guys, and they're all men in this picture, were part of what they called the Salvatore Club. This was the fan club for the racehorse, Salvatore. And I love some of these faces. You kind of see a lot of characters here. I just love the face of this guy. He looks like the kind of guy you really wouldn't want to trust in a dark alley. But some of the players you'll see here. This guy, you see one African-American in the whole crowd. That is Isaac Murphy. That was the jockey of Salvatore who won the race. Here's Haggin, right there. Kind of sitting back, enjoying the time. Here is his son, Ben Ali Haggin Jr. We're going to talk about him in a minute. He was overseeing the racehorse operation. In the back, this kind of bald-haired guy, this is Matt Burns. This was Daly's trainer. He was also Marcus Daly's trainer on the East Coast. Now, Burns is an interesting fellow because, for one thing, this event, this is his horse farm. This is where the clam bake occurs. So here you have this huge long table out in the woods. They're bringing in the food, they're bringing in the booze. We don't know for sure where all the buildings are, but you see some fences and stuff in the background. But some of the other players, this guy was Haggin's ranch manager, John McKay. There's John Mackey of the Comstock Load and John Mackey of Haggin, and it gets confusing because they have the same pronunciation of their name. But all of this is happening the same time that Daly is starting to show up on the East Coast with his racehorses. This is the period of time when Montana, the racehorse, debuts on the track as a 2-year-old. He wins the Carteret Handicap that year. He wins another race as a 3-year-old and comes in a heartbreaking second in the Belmont in 1891. And then we get into 1892, 1893. He wins some very major races and becomes Daly's first big champion. And by the way, Montana, the racehorse, was bred by Haggin. A lot of Daly's early stock came from Rancho del Paso. And this wasn't just because Haggin cut him a deal. Haggin had the biggest horse operation, certainly in the United States, probably in the world. But this was the peak for Haggin. The next year was horrible. First off, Ben Ali, his son, dies of pneumonia. And, just a young guy, he's in his 30s, all full of promise. At the same time, they're negotiating a kind of not an IPO exactly, but they're restructuring the Anaconda company to make it from a partnership and a closed corporation into a shareholder company. And that is because George Hearst has cancer, and he's dying. And so they restructure the company in January of 1891, right in the middle of doing all that. Ben Ali gets pneumonia, and Haggin is in Montana trying to do land deals, rushes back to New York on the train. His son dies, and barely 10 days, 11 days later, George Hearst dies. As if that wasn't bad enough, then Haggins, one of his daughters also dies that year. We don't know what of. She was considered a weak and sickly person. There are some speculation she may have had tuberculosis. We don't know. A lot of lung diseases back then. A lot of things that killed us that don't kill us now. And then, as if that wasn't enough, the railroads, we had the Utah Northern, which was owned by the Union Pacific, and then we had the East-West, the Northern Pacific. They normally were competitors, except in Montana, where they'd been colluding to jack up the price of freight. And they decide that they've got Daly over a barrel because the Montana Union line that they jointly controlled was the only route between Butte and Anaconda, because the Butte-Anaconda Pacific Railroad was not yet built. So they jack up the price of freight. Daly says, no, we had a contract, you can't do that. They said, we're going to do it anyway. And once again, Haggin's checkbook, here's a man grieving the death of a child, the loss of a business partner he'd known since the 1850s, another child on her deathbed, and the railroads are jerking him around. So, he and Daly shut down everything in March of 1891. And it stays shut down until October, when Daly finally puts, and Haggin together, they finally put the thumb screws to the railroad and they get a better deal. This is also when Daly decides it might be time to build the Butte-Anaconda and Pacific, and that'll take a few years before that comes to be. And eventually they remember how Haggin operates. Everything has to be the biggest, everything has to be the best. Daly's a little different from Haggin. He doesn't have to be the biggest, but he does like to be the best. And he's, during all of this stuff, he's colluding with James J. Hill of the Great Northern to bring the Montana Central, which is already in Butte, and then Hill helps him bankroll the Butte-Anaconda and Pacific. And by doing that and connecting Anaconda to the Great Northern line, he breaks the railroad monopoly by 1894. So this is how these guys operated. And if you think about Haggin through the eyes of having to deal with a lot of disrespect, distrust, stereotyping, remember that Daly is also subject to distrust, stereotyping. No Irish need apply. These two guys got each other. They understood because they had similar upbringing in terms of being part of a despised subgroup of people. And both of them really wanted to say, in your face. And so we're going to show you. Just a quick departure on Haggin's kids. His surviving son was Louis Tara Haggin. He had two surviving daughters. One died a little young. She had a couple of kids. The other one, this is a granddaughter, Edith Lounsbury Perry. This branch of the family wound up staying in racehorses. There was a William Haggin Perry that had racehorses into the late 20th century. James Ben Ali Haggin Jr., Ben Ali, his son, Ben Ali III, became kind of a noted portrait painter. He was really well known amongst the theater crowd. He was sort of an artiste, probably the most famous of the Haggin descendants. So a number of interesting people. The sad thing, though, was that Eliza did not manage to cope with the death of two adult children very well. And in 1891, she was about 70 years old by then, fell into a decline. She was 70 when she died. Falls into a decline for about 3 years, just getting sicker and sicker, and ultimately dies in 1894. Then it gets interesting. In the fall of 1894, and remember, if we know our Montana history, 1894 was the year of the Capitol fight, Daly and Clark. Haggin comes out to Montana September 1894. There he is. This is the guest register at Riverside and Hamilton at the Daly Mansion. Margaret Daly, she had, you can tell it's all the same handwriting. I don't know if that's her writing or somebody who was on her staff, but everybody signed the guest book when Mrs. Daly was there. And so on 25th of September, James Ben Ali Haggin, Louis Haggin, remember his son, Mrs. Richard Lounsbury, Miss Edith Lounsbury, that's that daughter we just saw in the earlier picture. And then an interesting lady, Miss Pearl Voorhees. She's Eliza's niece. She came out to take care of Eliza in her final sickness. And after Eliza died, she's staying on with Haggin in his home. They get married 3 years later. There's, if we take a look here, notice he's born in 1822. She's born in 1869. You can do that math. You're talking about the 40-some year. It's not just a May-December relationship. It's more like about March or April-December relationship. And it, of course, scandalizes the whole country. I mean, this is a bigger deal than, I don't know, Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. I mean, was that level of, oh my God. They had a very discreet wedding, tail end of 1897. I love this political cartoon that showed up right after they were married. You got Haggin. And of course, Pearl was about 28 by then, 28 or 29. And so even though she was a whole lot younger than he was, she was kind of old to get married, so she was kind of an old maid. They never had kids. I don't know, we're just going to close the curtain on that one. But she lives to be into her 90s. She lives to like 1965 or something. I mean, just a tremendously long life, 1965. What do you know, I remembered that. But when he marries her, he also gives her kind of an unlimited budget, and she loves parties, she loves fine dresses, she loves to entertain. And Haggin, remember, bottomless checkbook. She tries to find the bottom of his checkbook. She can't do it. But he is getting older. You know, he's not a young man himself. And he's starting to wind down Rancho del Paso, which gets us to the rest of his life. Now, first off, they get married. And the following October, we're back to the Riverside guest register. Look who signs. Margaret V. Haggin. Well, her real name was Margaret. They called her Pearl for short. V for Voorhees. Aha! Haggin was at the stock farm. Haggin was in Montana, October 1898. That was an election year. There was a, it's an off-year election. But look at the timeline. According to Frenzied Finance, Thomas Lawson said that Henry Huddleston Rogers of Standard Oil conceived of the idea of a copper trust about 1897. He was originally going to approach the Boston and Montana Company because Lawson was out of Boston, knew these guys. But remember there's that fellow by the name of Frederick Augustus Heinze? Well, Heinze, in that period of time, had gotten the Boston and Montana tied up in legal action, and it was in a receivership. So, according to Lawson, Henry Rogers approaches Marcus Daly and says, we've got this dream of a copper trust, and we need a big company to be the first company and on the ground floor of this copper trust, Amalgamated Copper, we're going to call it. And by the sheerest coincidence, he decides he wants to take a tour of Yellowstone Park and just a pleasure trip, a vacation. And while he's at it, let's go to Butte. That'll be kind of fun too. We're just here for fun. I'm here with my buddy, the doctor friend of mine. But guess who else he's with? A banker, a lawyer, and a civil engineer. Hello. And so you'll have to read Marcus Daly's Montana Empires for the rest of that story. But then, so Rogers is there in September. Haggin shows up with his new bride in October. Then, April of 1899, the following spring, we have the official announcement of the Amalgamated Copper Company. Haggin sells out, Tevis sells out. Between the two of them, they pocket about $15 million officially. And then sadly enough, Tevis dies. He hadn't really had a lot to do with Anaconda except kind of cashing the checks and making sure they were safe in Wells Fargo. So he dies, leaving Haggin kind of on his own. Now, what Haggin is up to is he's downsizing Rancho del Paso, and in 1897, remember, he gets married that year, he buys this farm called Elmendorf in Kentucky. It's fairly close to Louisville, or I'm sorry, Lexington. Slowly begins moving his racehorses to Elmendorf. He builds a brand new mansion for his bride. I mean, this was Green Hills. This was her Kentucky country estate. They also had a mansion in New York City. They also had a summer home at Newport, Rhode Island. Plus, they came out to Montana all the time. They still visited California from time to time. Haggin's trying to downsize. When he buys Elmendorf, there's about 500 acres, but he keeps buying land, and he keeps buying land, and keeps buying land, and ultimately Elmendorf Farm is at about 12,000 acres. So Haggin just can't stop doing everything big. The rest of that story, which is really fun, it's sad first, but then it gets fun. Daly dies in 1900. You can tell he's close to Haggin. Haggin is one of his pallbearers. And Haggin also buys out a lot of the Bitterroot Stock Farm animals, not all of them, but a lot of them. And in the meantime, he takes his winnings from Anaconda. He has nothing to do with Amalgamated Copper anymore. He's done. Buys a mine in Peru and does the exact same thing, consolidates land, winds up buying about 75 to 80% of all the mining claims in central Peru, starts mining copper, and 2 years after his death, you can see the money, $12 million net profit in 1916 dollars. Once he's fully dispersed Rancho del Paso, it happens about the same time there's a big ban on gambling. There's a progressive era reforms. Hart-Agnew Act in New York outlaws racetrack betting and bookmakers. Haggin throws a fit, sells almost all of his horses except for maybe a couple hundred favorites. Sells a lot of them to Europe, sells even more to Argentina. He's dispersing his herd all over the world. And then he starts buying cows and chickens and sheep and all of this, and builds this huge dairy operation, which becomes kind of his retirement plan, and he just goes big into dairy. He makes a deal with Kentucky A&M to hire work-study students to milk all his cows. He has 1,000 milking cows going on, and it's kind of an early agricultural experiment station. He actually becomes an advocate for clean milk, sanitary, modern milk production, and this was a big progressive era reform. So whatever bad things he did in his life, it's like this was kind of how he was trying to make up for it, I think, was to make sure that the children of Kentucky had pure and clean and healthy milk to drink. And so that was kind of an interesting tale. He lives to be 91. This is one of the last known photographs of Haggin in his late, either 90 or thereabouts, not long before he died. He was buried in New York City, not in Kentucky. Pearl pretty much stays in New York City, but she spends the fortune slowly. Her share of it, remember his kids also got some pretty good, they were all comfortable. But she engages in a lot of philanthropy in Kentucky. Elmendorf sells to this, Joseph Widener was into racehorses, long story there, but he downsized Elmendorf. He only bought maybe, I can't remember, about 1,500 acres of it, and the rest of it got subdivided, and he tore down Green Hills. And this is all that's left of these pillars. If you go back, see the pillars right there? He tore down Green Hills, and that's what's left today. So it's kind of fascinating. And then for the rest of the story, James Ben Ali Haggin is now considered a pillar of the turf. He's in the Horse Racing Hall of Fame. There is a Haggin Museum in Stockton, California, named for his son Louis, and has most of his art and a lot of other very important items. And of course, Mount Haggin, Anaconda Smelter Stack, is our legacy here in Montana. And with that, we're finished. Open to questions, and shameless plug, I have my book for sale here, and the other one's coming out. So questions, comments?